Imagine a world where a single whisper could end your life, and a single signature could erase an entire village from the map. This is the story of a boy born in the dirt of a Georgian shack who clawed his way through the shadows of the underground to become the most feared man on the planet. A leader who turned his own heart into a fortress of iron and his nation into a factory of both miracles and massacres. Over the next 19 chapters, we will strip away the propaganda and the myth to reveal the terrifying psychology of Joseph Stalin, the shoemaker's son who became the man of steel. We will travel from the violent streets of Gori to the blood-stained basements of the Lubyanka, and finally to the lonely silence of a dacha, where a god lay dying on the floor. Stay with us as we journey into the heart of the 20th century's darkest empire, to witness the rise and the fall of a man who moved nations like chess pieces, and whose shadow still looms over the world today. This is the complete and definitive history of the Red Sun. Imagine a boy born in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, a child of poverty with a withered arm and a face scarred by disease, who would transform himself from a humble poet and priest in training into the man of steel. A figure so cold and so powerful that he would move entire nations like pieces of coal, building a superpower on a foundation of industrial iron and human bone. Born in the final days of 1878 in the cramped, airless, and sun-scorched wooden shack in the town of Gori, Joseph Jugashvili entered a world where the very air was thick with the scent of poverty and the constant threat of violence. His father, Bessarion, was a man whose hands were hardened by the leather of the shoes he made, but whose heart was softened and then rotted by the cheap vodka of the Georgian taverns, leading to nights of terror, where the young boy would huddle in the corner as his father's drunken rage descended upon him, and his mother kick in a storm of heavy blows and shattered furniture. These early years were a baptism in brutality, where he learned that the person who was supposed to protect him was the very source of his pain. A psychological lesson that would forever instill in him the belief that no one could be trusted and that love was merely a weakness to be exploited by the strong. His mother was a woman of fierce and pious determination, who washed the clothes of the wealthy and endured her husband's wrath only to pour all her frustrated ambitions into her surviving son. She dreamed of him wearing the golden robes of a bishop and standing at the altar of the great cathedral in Tbilisi, a vision of escape from the filth of Gori that Joseph both embraced for its promise of power and resented for its stifling religious discipline. At the age of 7, he was struck by the devastating smallpox virus, which left his face a landscape of deep and permanent pits, a physical deformity that made him the target of cruel taunts from other children and fueled a simmering, quiet rage that would one day demand the absolute submission of everyone who looked upon him. Then came the accident with the Phaeton carriage, where the heavy wheels crushed his left arm, leaving it permanently shorter and stiffer than his right. A secret shame that he would hide for the rest of his life by wearing oversized sleeves and carefully positioning himself in every official photograph. He was a lonely and introspective child who found solace in the epic poetry of Georgia, writing his own verses that spoke of the moon and the mountains and the suffering of the poor, showing a fleeting glimpse of a sensitive soul that he would soon bury under layers of revolutionary ice. When he entered the Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary as a scholarship student, he was a boy caught between two worlds: the rigid and suffocating world of the monks who monitored his every thought, and the secret, dangerous world of the underground student circles, where the forbidden ideas of socialism and national identity were whispered in the dark. He began to see the church not as a sanctuary, but as a tool of the Tsarist state used to keep the masses in chains. And he found a new God in the writings of Karl Marx, who promised a world where the shoemaker's son could stand as equal to the prince. He was eventually expelled from the seminary for his radical activities, a moment that marked his final break with traditional morality and his total commitment to the life of a professional revolutionary, adopting the name Koba after a legendary Georgian bandit who was loyal only to his own code of revenge. He spent the next 2 decades in a shadow world of aliases and secret hideouts and constant fear, organizing daring bank robberies that the Bolsheviks called expropriations to fund the party's activities and gain the favor of Lenin, who saw in this quiet and cold Georgian the perfect instrument of his will. Joseph survived multiple arrests and exiles to the most desolate corners of Siberia, places where the wind screamed across the tundra and the temperature dropped so low that the breath froze in the air. And it was in these lonely years of exile that he truly became Stalin, the man of steel. He lost his first wife, Kato, to typhus, and standing over her open grave, he famously declared that his last warm feelings for humanity had died with her. His heart was now a fortress of stone where no emotion could enter and no mercy could escape. He watched from the fringes of history as the Russian Empire began to crumble under the weight of World War I, preparing himself for the moment when the chaos would provide him the chance to seize the throne of the Tsars and reshape the world in his own cold and mechanical image. He was a master of the long game, a man who could wait in the darkness for years while his rivals talked of theory and philosophy, knowing that when the time came, he would be the one holding the files and the secrets and the power to decide who lived and who died in the name of the revolution. He was no longer a boy from Gori, but a force of history, a silent architect of a new and terrifying era where his face would be seen in every home and his name would be whispered with a fear that would chill the blood of generations to come. With the final, rattling breath of Vladimir Lenin in January 1924, the vast and shivering landscape of the Soviet Union was left without a father, creating a sudden and terrifying vacuum of power that set the stage for one of the most ruthless and intricate political struggles in the history of the modern world. Joseph Stalin, the man who had spent years operating in the deep shadows of the party bureaucracy as the seemingly humble general secretary, realized that his time had finally arrived to step out of the darkness and claim the mantle of the revolution, while his more flamboyant and intellectual rivals like Leon Trotsky and Gregory Zinoviev were busy delivering grand, soaring orations to the masses about the dream of world revolution and the purity of Marxist theory. Stalin was busy with the dull but deadly business of the filing cabinet. He understood a fundamental truth that his enemies ignored, which was that, in a centralized state, true power does not belong to the loudest voice, but to the man who controls the personnel and the promotions and the secret dossiers of every member of the party. He began by carefully orchestrating Lenin's funeral as a massive and quasi-religious spectacle of grief, positioning himself as the chief mourner and the most loyal disciple of the fallen leader, despite the fact that Lenin had written a final testament calling for Stalin's removal due to his rudeness and his excessive power. Stalin used his immense influence over the Central Committee to suppress this document and keep it hidden from the public eye. He then formed a shifting and treacherous alliance known as the Triumvirate with Zinoviev and Kamenev to systematically isolate and discredit Trotsky, painting him as a dangerous and arrogant Bonapartist who would lead the nation into a catastrophic and endless war with the capitalist West. Stalin countered Trotsky's call for permanent revolution with his own strategically brilliant doctrine of socialism in one country, a message that resonated deeply with a Russian populace that was exhausted by years of civil war and famine and simply wanted to rebuild their own strength within their own borders. As Trotsky's influence withered and he was eventually stripped of his military command and exiled to the far reaches of the empire, Stalin turned his sights on his own allies, using his control over the secret police and the party. Appointments to fill the Kremlin with men who were not brilliant thinkers, but were, instead, terrified and loyal sycophants who owed their very existence to his favor. He created a vast and invisible pyramid of iron where he sat at the very apex, managing the smallest details of the lives of his subjects and building a secret police apparatus that turned every citizen into a potential informant. He began to craft the cult of the apparatus, where the party was no longer a collection of debate-loving revolutionaries, but a monolithic machine that functioned with a single mechanical will. By 1929, on the occasion of his 50th birthday, the transformation was complete, and Joseph Stalin emerged as the undisputed vozd, or the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. He celebrated this milestone not with humility, but by launching the most violent and transformative social experiment in human history, known as the First Five-Year Plan. He believed, with a cold and clinical certainty, that the individual must be crushed for the collective to survive, and he ordered the total and merciless liquidation of the kulaks, the independent and relatively wealthy peasants, as a social class, to ensure that the state had absolute control over the food supply. This war against the countryside was a campaign of state-sponsored terror that involved mass deportations to the frozen gulags and execution, squads that scoured the villages for hidden grain, triggering a man-made famine of such horrific proportions that it claimed the lives of millions in the Ukraine and the North Caucasus. Stalin viewed these staggering casualties not as a tragedy, but as a mere statistic in the grand ledger of industrial progress. He spent his nights in the Kremlin, hunched over his desk under the dim light of a single lamp, smoking his pipe and signing the execution lists with the same detached calm that he used to approve a new factory design. He had successfully replaced the old revolutionary spirit with a cold and mechanical obedience, turning the name Stalin into a symbol of a godlike and absolute authority that could reshape the very earth and the hearts of men through the sheer force of a singular and pitiless will. He was now the master of a continent, a ruler who had traded the possibility of human connection for the absolute and lonely certainty of total domination, preparing his fortress for the storms of the future, while the memory of the shoemaker's son from Gori was buried under the weight of his own iron myth. As the decade of the 1930s deepened and the Soviet Union began to resemble a giant, smoking engine of industrial production, a dark and toxic cloud of paranoia began to settle over the mind of the man in the Kremlin, who felt that despite his absolute power, he was still surrounded by ghosts of the past and hidden daggers in the present. Stalin became convinced that the revolution was being eaten from within by a sprawling fifth column of saboteurs and spies and old Bolsheviks who secretly longed for the days of Lenin or the return of the exiled Trotsky. The catalyst for the eruption of mass bloodletting was the assassination of Sergei Kirov in December 1934. A charismatic and popular party leader in Leningrad whose death provided Stalin with the perfect, bloody pretext to launch a nationwide crusade against anyone who dared to possess an independent thought or a shred of personal dignity. He unleashed the NKVD under the leadership of the cruel and diminutive Nikolai Yezhov, a man who became known as the Iron Hedgehog and whose name would forever be associated with the most frantic and murderous phase of the purges. What followed was a period of collective madness, where the state turned its fury upon its own creators, starting with the legendary show trials in Moscow, where the founding fathers of the revolution, like Zinoviev and Kamenev and Bukharin, were paraded before the world like broken animals. They were subjected to days of relentless sleep, deprivation, and psychological torture and threats against their families until they confessed in open court to preposterous and fabricated crimes such as poisoning cattle or plotting with the Nazis or trying to restore capitalism in the Soviet Union. Stalin watched these proceedings from behind a heavy, dark curtain in the balcony of the courtroom, his eyes cold and unblinking as he witnessed the destruction of the men who had once been his comrades and his equals. Once the confessions were recorded and the public humiliation was complete, these men were taken to the damp, soundproofed basements of the Lubyanka prison, where they were forced to kneel and were shot in the back of the head by executioners, who wore leather aprons to protect themselves from the spray of blood. But the purge did not stop at the top. It cascaded down through every layer of Soviet society like a lethal infection, reaching the factory floor and the collective farm and the scientific laboratory, where a single whispered denunciation from a jealous neighbor or a frightened colleague was enough to send a person into the maw of the secret police. The NKVD was issued strict quotas for arrests and executions, and Stalin personally reviewed thousands of names on long, horrifying lists, often scrawling orders in thick red ink to beat and beat again until the prisoners provided more names of accomplices. He then turned his suspicious gaze toward the Red Army, the very shield of the revolution, and decapitated its leadership by executing Marshal Tukhachevsky and 3 out of 5 marshals and 15 out of 16 army commanders, leaving the Soviet military a hollowed-out shell of its former self. Just as the storm of World War II was gathering on the horizon, the atmosphere in Moscow became one of total and suffocating silence, where people learned to communicate in signs, and where the sound of a car engine in the middle of the night meant that a family was about to be torn apart forever. The Gulag system expanded into a massive slave labor empire that produced the timber and the gold and the coal that fueled the Soviet economy. A world of barbed wire and frozen tundra, where millions of innocent souls were worked to death in temperatures that dropped to 50 degrees below zero. Stalin viewed this mass slaughter not as a crime, but as a necessary and holy purification of the Soviet spirit, a way to ensure that when the ultimate test of war arrived, there would be no one left to question his commands or doubt his divinity. By the time the terror began to subside in 1939, the Man of Steel had successfully murdered the old Bolshevik party and replaced it with a class of terrified bureaucrats who owed their lives to his whim and who lived in constant, shivering fear of the man who had turned their country into a giant laboratory of death. He had effectively wiped out the memory of the 1917 revolution and replaced it with a cult of personality where he was the only source of light and the only arbiter of truth in a world of absolute darkness. Stalin understood with a cold and clinical and terrifying clarity that the Soviet Union was a vulnerable and backward giant surrounded by a ring of hostile capitalist nations who wanted to see the Bolshevik Revolution fail and die in the dust of history. And he famously declared to a gathering of industrial managers in 1931 that they were 50 to 100 years behind the advanced nations of the West, and that they must close this massive gap in a single decade, or they would be crushed under the iron boots of foreign invaders who viewed them as nothing more than raw material for their own empires. He launched the first 5-year plan with a fanatical and relentless energy that turned the entire nation from the Baltic to the Pacific into a giant and chaotic construction site where the roar of the factory and the hiss of the steam engine replaced the ancient and rhythmic silence of the Russian village. He prioritized heavy industry above all else, focusing with an obsessive intensity on the production of coal and steel and electricity and chemicals as the four essential and unbreakable pillars of a modern superpower that could eventually produce the tens of thousands of tanks and planes and guns needed for the inevitable and coming global struggle. Magnitogorsk rose from the barren and frozen and windswept dirt of the Urals as a cathedral of iron and fire, where thousands of idealistic young Komsomol workers and millions of forced laborers lived in makeshift tents and dug foundations in the freezing mud with their bare hands, dying by the hundreds every single day from exhaustion and malnutrition and accidents, to build the massive blast furnaces that would fuel the Soviet war machine for generations to come. The Dnieper Dam became a shimmering and powerful symbol of Stalin's victory over the forces of nature, a massive concrete monument to the power of the central state to reshape the physical world according to its own mechanical and cold needs, while the White Sea Canal was dug by hand by hundreds of thousands of Gulag prisoners, who moved millions of tons of frozen earth with nothing but primitive shovels and wooden wheelbarrows, dying by the thousands in a project that Stalin demanded be completed with a speed that made human life and human dignity completely irrelevant to the grand and blood-stained design of the state. He abolished the free market and the small shops and the independent farmers of the previous era with a single stroke of his pen, replacing them with a rigid and absolute central planning system where every single nail and every ton of coal and every loaf of bread was directed by the state bureaucracy in Moscow through the powerful and faceless agency of Gazprom. The workers were exhorted by the constant and deafening propaganda myth of Alexei Stakhanov, the legendary miner who allegedly tripled his quota in a single shift through sheer socialist will, a story used to drive the laborers to work harder and faster and longer for the glory of the socialist motherland, while those who failed to meet the impossible and ever-increasing targets were accused of wrecking and sabotage and were sent to the frozen wastes of the north to work until they died in the shadows. Stalin viewed the horrific suffering of the peasants and the starvation of the workers as a necessary and unavoidable sacrifice for the creation of a modern industrial fortress that could survive a world at war. He imported expensive Western technology and engineers from America and Germany during the depths of the Great Depression, paying for them with grain that was seized from the starving mouths of Ukrainian farmers during the Holocaust, leading to a famine of such staggering and horrific scale that it remains a dark and permanent scar on the memory of the 20th century. By the end of the second five-year plan in 1937, the Soviet Union had miraculously and violently become the world's second-largest industrial economy, a feat achieved through a level of human misery and state-sponsored violence that the world had never seen before in human history. Stalin had built a fortress of steel, but it was a fortress inhabited by shadows and broken men, a place where the light of the individual had been permanently extinguished by the roar of the factory and the absolute and unquestioned command of the was. He was now ready to face the world with a military and industrial power that was entirely his own creation, a testament to the terrifying and unstoppable efficacy of the man of steel's iron will to dominate both nature and humanity in his quest for an eternal empire of the proletariat, as the dark and lengthening shadows of a second global war began to stretch across the European continent in the late 1930s. Stalin watched the complex maneuvers of Hitler and the Western democracies with a deep and cynical and icy suspicion. He realized with his sharp political instinct that the British and the French governments were secretly hoping to divert the aggressive Nazi war machine toward the east to destroy the Bolshevik menace once and for all, while Adolf Hitler was looking for a tactical and temporary way to avoid a dangerous two-front war before he was truly ready to strike at the heart of Russia. Stalin decided to play a game of extreme and heartless realpolitik that would shock the entire world to its core. And in the late-night hours of August 23rd, 1939, he authorized his foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov to sign a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in the presence of Joachim von Ribbentrop. This was the famous and infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a stunning deal between the two most bitter ideological enemies on Earth that contained a secret and predatory protocol to divide Poland and the Baltic states and parts of Finland between them like a piece of rich cake. Stalin believed with a smug and arrogant satisfaction that he was outsmarting Hitler, buying himself precious and vital time to rebuild his military leadership, which had been decimated by his own paranoid purges, and to push the Soviet borders further west to create a massive and defensible buffer zone against a future Nazi invasion. He watched from the safety of the Kremlin as the German panzers crushed the Polish army in a matter of weeks, and then turned their fury west to humiliate and defeat France, while he quietly and systematically occupied Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and launched the brutal Winter War against Finland to secure the northern approaches to Leningrad. However, the Winter War proved to be a shocking and bloody humiliation for the Red Army as the small and determined Finnish force held back the Soviet giant for months in the deep snow, revealing a catastrophic level of incompetence and a total lack of leadership that Stalin himself had caused by executing his best and most brilliant generals. He reacted to this failure by frantically accelerating the production of new and revolutionary tanks like the T-30-4 and moving his vital factories deep into the interior of the country beyond the reach of any enemy bombers. He stubbornly and dangerously ignored the increasingly desperate warnings from his own network of spies and from the British government that Hitler was gathering the largest invasion force in human history on the Soviet border under the code name Operation Barbarossa. Stalin's paranoia had turned inward once again, and he became convinced that these intelligence reports were a clever British provocation designed to trick him into a premature and suicidal war with Germany. He stayed at his private dacha, a man blinded by his own perceived cleverness and his belief that Hitler would not dare to attack until he had completely finished his war with England. He continued to send massive trainloads of oil and grain and rubber and manganese to Germany until the very last hour of peace, fueling the very military machine that was about to turn and tear his empire into pieces. The man of steel had made his greatest and most perilous gamble. And as the summer sun began to rise on the 22nd of June 1941, he was about to discover that in the ruthless game of dictators, the only prize for a single mistake is the threat of total and absolute annihilation. He remained in a state of shock for several days as the reality of the betrayal set in, withdrawing from public life and leaving the Soviet people leaderless in the face of the greatest invasion they had ever known. It was only when his ministers came to him and pleaded for leadership that he finally found his voice again, preparing to lead his nation into a struggle that would be known as the Great Patriotic War, a conflict of such unimaginable scale and suffering that it would test the very foundations of the iron world he had spent his life building. As the first light of dawn broke over the western frontier on the 22nd of June, 1941, the peace was shattered by the roar of thousands of German guns and the screech of Stuka dive bombers, marking the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, which was the largest and most murderous invasion in the history of human warfare. Stalin was initially paralyzed by a state of deep psychological shock and retreated to his private dacha in a rare moment of utter despair, where he remained silent for days as the Nazi war machine tore through the Red Army with a speed that seemed unstoppable. He had spent years purging his own officer corps and ignoring the frantic warnings of his spies, and now he watched from his isolation as millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled and captured in massive pockets like Minsk and Bialystok. The Soviet people were left leaderless and terrified, while the German panzers raced across the vast plains of the east. But eventually, a delegation of his ministers arrived at his dacha to plead for his return to Moscow. Stalin, fearing they had come to arrest him, was instead met with their desperate submission, and he realized that the iron system he had built could only function with his hand at the wheel. He returned to the Kremlin and assumed the role of supreme commander, transforming the struggle into the Great Patriotic War by invoking the ghosts of Russian history and the spirit of national survival rather than just Marxist ideology. He ordered the scorched earth policy, where every field was burned and every bridge was blown and every factory was dismantled and shipped by rail to the far side of the Urals to prevent the invaders from utilizing Soviet resources. As the autumn rains turned the Russian roads into a thick and impassable sea of mud, and the first bites of the legendary Russian winter began to freeze the fuel in the German tanks, Stalin made the fateful decision to remain in Moscow, even as the Nazi high command could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. He organized a defiant and legendary parade in Red Square on the 7th of November, where the soldiers marched straight from the cobblestones to the front lines just a few miles away in the suburbs of the capital. He placed his trust in Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the brilliant and hard-nosed commander, who realized that the German supply lines were overstretched and that the Nazi soldiers were not equipped for the sub-zero temperatures that were turning the battlefield into a graveyard of ice. Stalin authorized a massive and secret counteroffensive using fresh and winter-hardened divisions brought in from Siberia, which struck the exhausted Germans with a ferocity that pushed them back from the gates of the city. This victory at the gates of Moscow was the first time Hitler's blitzkrieg had been truly halted, and it proved to the world that the Soviet Union would not collapse like France or Poland. Stalin had survived the first and most dangerous blow of the war, but he knew that the road ahead would be paved with the bodies of millions of his subjects, and that the real test of the man of steel was only just beginning as the war shifted south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore his name. He sat in his bunker under the streets of Moscow, a man who had regained his icy composure and was now prepared to burn the entire world to the ground, if it meant the survival of his empire and his own absolute power. By the summer of 1942, the focal point of the global struggle shifted toward the south as Hitler launched Case Blue to seize the vital oil fields of the Caucasus and to capture the city of Stalingrad, which stood as a powerful symbolic gateway. On the banks of the Volga River, Stalin realized that the fall of the city that bore his name would be a psychological and strategic catastrophe that could collapse the entire Soviet war effort, and so he issued the legendary and terrifying order, number 227, famously known as Not a Step Back. He authorized the creation of blocking detachments of the NKVD, who were ordered to shoot any Soviet soldier who retreated without permission, and he turned the ruins of Stalingrad into a giant and bloody meat grinder, where the average life expectancy of a newly arrived soldier was less than 24 hours. The battle became a primitive and horrific struggle for every individual cellar and every broken wall and every factory floor, where the soldiers fought with knives and bricks and shovels in a war of rats that exhausted the German Sixth Army. Stalin placed his faith in the grim and methodical planning of Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who were secretly gathering a massive force of over 1 million men and thousands of tanks for a daring pincer movement known as Operation Uranus. While the Germans were bogged down in the urban street fighting, Stalin's hidden armies struck the weak and poorly equipped Romanian and Italian flanks in November 1942, encircling nearly 300,000 Nazi soldiers in a pocket of ice and fire. Hitler refused to allow a breakout, and Stalin watched with a cold and mounting satisfaction as the legendary Sixth Army slowly starved and froze to death in the ruins they had created. When Field Marshal Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, it was the greatest military defeat in German history, and the moment the world realized that the man of steel was winning the war of attrition. Stalin was now elevated to the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union, and he began to emerge from the darkness of his bunker to take his place as a global statesman who would help decide the future of the world alongside Churchill and Roosevelt. He understood that Stalingrad was not just a victory of arms, but a victory of the Soviet system over the Nazi machine, and he used this prestige to demand that his Western allies open a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on his bleeding nation. He remained indifferent to the staggering loss of life among his own troops, viewing the millions of fallen soldiers as the necessary fuel for the furnace of victory, and he began to plan for the eventual march on Berlin, where he intended to settle the score with Hitler once and for all. The tide had turned, and the man who had once been a fugitive in the Siberian snow was now the master of a military machine that was becoming the most powerful force on the face of the earth. Following the monumental victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army began a relentless and unstoppable westward surge across the scorched plains of the Soviet Union and into the heart of Eastern Europe. Stalin now occupied a position of unprecedented global power, and he prepared to meet his Western counterparts, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, for the first time at the Tehran Conference in late 1943, where he displayed a calculated blend of charming host and cold-blooded realist. He arrived in a simple military tunic that contrasted sharply with the opulent surroundings, projecting the image of a soldier king who had personally borne the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, while the British and Americans hesitated to launch a cross-channel invasion. He used this moral and military leverage to dominate the negotiations, securing a firm promise for Operation Overlord and ensuring that the Soviet Union would have a predominant hand in reshaping the borders of Poland and the Baltic states after the war. His psychology at the diplomatic table was one of extreme suspicion, masked by a dry and often dark sense of humor, as he famously joked about executing 50,000 German officers to ensure Germany could never rise again, a comment that horrified Churchill but was delivered with a chillingly flat expression that made it impossible to tell if he was truly jesting. As his armies liberated territory from the Nazi yoke, Stalin was careful to install communist-led committees in every major city, ensuring that the liberation would actually be a transition into a new kind of Soviet-controlled order. He oversaw the massive and complex operations like Bagration in 1944, which shattered the German center and brought the Red Army to the very gates of Warsaw, where he notoriously allowed the Polish resistance to be crushed by the Nazis before moving in to take control himself. By the time the Big Three met again at Yalta in February 1945, Stalin was the absolute master of the situation with his troops, already occupying much of Eastern Europe and his influence extending deep into the Balkans. He outmaneuvered a failing Roosevelt and a defiant but weakened Churchill to win recognition for a Soviet sphere of influence that would soon be known as the Iron Curtain. He viewed these conferences not as a search for a lasting peace, but as a division of spoils between empires, and he treated the fate of millions of Poles and Czechs and Hungarians as mere tokens in a grand game of geopolitical poker. Even as victory neared, he remained obsessed with the smallest details of the coming occupation of Berlin, ordering his marshals Zhukov and Konev into a bloody race to capture the city first, so that the glory and the spoils of the Nazi capital would belong to him alone. He was a man who understood that history is written by the victors in the blood of the vanquished, and he was prepared to pay any price in Soviet lives to ensure that the final map of Europe was drawn in the ink of the Kremlin. The shoemaker's son was now the arbiter of the world's destiny, preparing to stand over the ruins of Berlin as the most powerful conqueror since the days of the Tsar. In the final bloody weeks of April 1945, Stalin directed the capture of Berlin with a ruthless and frantic energy, driving his marshals, Zhukov and Konev, to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives in a desperate race to plant the red flag atop the Reichstag before the Western Allies could reach the city. He viewed the Nazi capital not just as a military objective, but as a personal trophy of his own suffering and triumph. And he watched with a cold satisfaction from Moscow as his troops reduced the heart of the Third Reich to a landscape of ash and rubble. Even as Hitler breathed his last in the bunker, Stalin was already looking toward the post-war order, preparing for the final meeting of the Big Three at Potsdam in July 1945, where he would face a new American President Harry Truman and a departing Winston Churchill. At Potsdam, Stalin was at the height of his intimidating power, appearing in the white and gold uniform of a generalissimo and projecting an aura of impenetrable calm while the West grew, increasingly alarmed by the rapid Sovietization of Eastern Europe. He was informed by Truman of the existence of a new and terrifying weapon of extraordinary force, but Stalin showed no emotion, having already been briefed on the Manhattan Project by his vast network of spies, and he simply nodded his head, as if the atomic bomb were merely another tool in the arsenal of empires. He used the conference to formalize the new borders of Poland and to ensure that Germany would be stripped of its industry and its dignity to pay for the Soviet losses. He viewed the division of Germany into occupation zones not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent strategic reality that would protect the Soviet Union from another invasion for 1,000 years. His psychology during these weeks was one of supreme confidence, masked by a calculated and quiet menace, as he realized that the Grand Alliance was dying and that a new and even more dangerous struggle was about to begin between the land power of the East and the nuclear power of the West. He returned to Moscow as a godlike figure, the man who had crushed fascism and expanded the borders of communism to the center of the European continent. But even in his moment of greatest victory, he remained a prisoner of his own deep paranoia, immediately launching a new wave of internal repressions to ensure that the returning soldiers and the weary populace did not mistake the victory for a chance at freedom or reform. As the fires of the Second World War finally faded into the smoldering embers of a broken Europe, Stalin did not seek a peace of reconciliation, but instead began to construct a massive and impenetrable barrier of political and military control that Winston Churchill would famously describe as an iron curtain stretching from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Stalin was a man who believed that security could only be found in the total domination of geography, and he systematically transformed the liberated nations of Poland and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia into satellite states where local communist parties were installed as puppets of the Kremlin through a series of rigged elections and brutal purges of non-communist politicians. He viewed the Western offer of Marshall Plan aid as a poisonous Trojan horse, designed to undermine Soviet influence, and he forced his Eastern European neighbors to reject the help even as their people starved in the ruins of their cities. His paranoia was suddenly and violently reignited in August 1945, when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because he realized that the Americans now possessed a weapon that made the Red Army's millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks obsolete in a single flash of light. Stalin felt a deep and personal humiliation that he had been outpaced in the scientific race, and he reacted with a frantic and obsessive energy to break the American nuclear monopoly, ordering his secret police chief Lavrenti Beria to take personal charge of the Soviet atomic project and to utilize every resource of the state, from the labor of 1 million Gulag prisoners in the uranium mines to the brilliance of physicists who worked under the constant threat of execution if they failed. He relied heavily on a vast and sophisticated network of atomic spies who had infiltrated the Manhattan Project at its highest levels and who funneled blueprints and technical data back to Moscow through the shadows of global diplomacy. Stalin watched the development of the Cold War with a cold and calculating eye as he authorized the Berlin blockade in 1948 to test the resolve of the Western Allies, only to be frustrated by the massive and unexpected success of the American airlift. He realized that the struggle for global supremacy was no longer just about territory, but about technology and ideology and the capacity for total destruction. And when the Soviet Union finally tested its first atomic bomb in the desert of Kazakhstan in August 1949, Stalin felt a grim satisfaction that he had restored the balance of power and made his empire invulnerable once again. He was now the master of a nuclear-armed fortress that spanned 2 continents, and he began to look toward the east to support the communist revolution in China and the coming struggle in Korea. Confident that the man of steel could outlast any democracy in a long and grinding war of nerves. By the dawn of the 1950s, gaze had shifted from the frozen borders of Europe to the rising heat of the East, where the triumph of Mao Zedong's communist revolution in China had fundamentally altered the global balance of power and given the man of steel a new and powerful ally in his crusade against Western capitalism. Stalin played a cautious and deceptive game when Kim Il-sung, the young and ambitious leader of North Korea, came to him repeatedly begging for permission to invade the South and unify the peninsula under the red flag. Stalin initially hesitated because he feared a direct confrontation with the United States before the Soviet nuclear arsenal was fully ready, but after the success of his own atomic test and the American withdrawal of troops from South Korea, he finally gave his blessing, provided that Mao and the Chinese would provide the necessary ground support if the situation turned dire. He viewed the Korean conflict as a perfect proxy war, where he could test American resolve and bleed their resources without risking a single Soviet soldier on the front lines, sending only hidden pilots and advisors, while the North Koreans, and later the Chinese, volunteers fought the bloody battles in the mud and the mountains. His psychology during the war was one of cold manipulation, as he frequently pushed Mao to keep fighting even when the Chinese leader wanted to seek a ceasefire, because Stalin believed that a long and grinding conflict in Korea would distract the Americans from Europe and allow the Soviet Union to continue its quiet and relentless expansion in the shadows. He sat in his dacha, reading the daily casualty reports from the 38th parallel with the same detached indifference he had shown to his own people during the Great Famine, calculating the value of every life lost in terms of its impact on the global chess match. Back in Moscow, he used the heightened tension of the Cold War to justify a new and suffocating wave of internal security measures, as he became increasingly convinced that his own inner circle was plotting against him. He began to purge the Leningrad Party leadership and launched the infamous Doctors, plot based on the anti-Semitic delusion that his personal physicians were working for Zionist and American intelligence to poison the Soviet leadership. He lived in a state of an isolation, surrounded by guards who were terrified to enter his room without being called, and who watched their master descend into a dark and lonely madness where everyone was an assassin and every meal was a potential source of venom. He was a man who had conquered half the world, but could not find peace in his own home, spending his nights pacing the corridors of the Kuntsevo Dacha and drinking heavy wine with his fearful henchmen, like Beria and Khrushchev, who laughed at his jokes and trembled at his silence. The Korean War eventually settled into a brutal stalemate that mirrored own frozen and unyielding mind as he prepared for a Third World War that he believed was both inevitable and necessary to secure the final victory of the proletariat. He was the master of a global empire of fear, but as 953 approached the iron machinery of his body was beginning to fail, and the man of steel was about to confront the one enemy that even he could not purge or exile into the shadows. As the year 1952 drew to a close, the atmosphere within the high walls of the Kremlin and the secluded dacha at Kuntsevo became thick with a poisonous and suffocating fog of suspicion that surpassed even the darkest days of the 1930s. Stalin had become a prisoner of his own absolute power and a victim of a deteriorating mind that saw daggers in every shadow and poison in every cup. He began to turn his cold and unforgiving gaze upon his own loyal inner circle of henchmen, like the sycophantic Molotov and the brutal Beria, and even the jovial Khrushchev, suspecting that they were merely waiting for him to die so they could dismantle his iron empire and sell its secrets to the imperialist West. The most bizarre and terrifying manifestation of this final madness was the launch of the infamous Doctors plot, which began when a relatively unknown female doctor named Lydia Timosh wrote a letter accusing personal physicians of deliberately mismanaging the health of high-ranking Soviet officials to bring about their early deaths. Stalin seized upon this flimsy and fabricated accusation with a manic energy, turning it into a massive anti-Semitic campaign that targeted the mostly Jewish medical elite of Moscow and accusing them of being a Zionist fifth column working for the American CIA to decapitate the Soviet leadership. He personally directed the interrogation of the doctors from his dacha, ordering his secret police to beat the elderly men until they confessed to impossible conspiracies, and he even threatened his security chiefs with execution if they did not provide the evidence he demanded to justify a new and massive purge of the entire party and the military. He planned to use the plot as a pretext to deport the entire Jewish population of the Soviet Union to the frozen wastes of Siberia in a repeat of the horrific ethnic cleansings of his earlier years. His health was rapidly failing as his blood pressure soared and his arteries hardened, but his fear of being poisoned was so great that he refused to take the very medications that might have saved his life. He lived in a state of hypervigilance and isolation in a house with double-locked doors and a security detail that was terrified to enter his presence without being summoned, spending his nights pacing the corridors and watching movies alone in his theater while his ministers trembled at the thought of their next dinner invitation, where a single misplaced word could mean a sentence of death. He was a man who had conquered continents and defeated the Nazi war machine, but he was now being defeated by the ghosts of his own imagination and the frailty of his own aging body. The man of steel was rusting from within, and as the cold March winds of 1953 began to blow across the Russian plains, the stage was set for a final and mysterious collapse that would end the longest and bloodiest reign in the history of the modern world, leaving behind a nation that was physically strong but spiritually broken, and a circle of successors who were already sharpening their knives for the struggle to come. On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin hosted one of his typical and grueling late-night dinners at the Kuntsevo Dacha, where he drank diluted Georgian wine and watched movies with his inner circle of Beria and Malenkov and Krust and Bulganin until the early hours of the morning, before dismissing them with a wave of his hand and retiring to his private rooms for what would be the last time. The guards who were stationed outside his door were under strict and terrifying orders never to disturb his rest or enter his chambers without a direct summons. So when no movement was heard from inside the room throughout the following day, they remained frozen in a state of indecisive fear, even as the hours ticked by and the silence from the man of steel became deafening. It was not until late in the evening on March 1st that a cautious maid finally entered the room to deliver his mail and found the supreme leader of the Soviet Union lying on the floor in his pajamas, unable to speak and soaked in his own urine, having suffered a massive and catastrophic stroke in the left hemisphere of his brain. His henchmen were summoned in the middle of the night, but instead of rushing to find the best medical help, they spent hours in a state of paralyzed hesitation and calculated delay because they were terrified of his reaction if he recovered, and they were secretly relieved at the prospect of his departure from the world. Beria, in particular, reportedly displayed a mixture of frantic loyalty when Stalin seemed to regain consciousness, and a sneering contempt when he lapsed back into a coma, and for more than 12 hours no doctors were called to the dacha, while the most powerful man on earth lay helpless and dying on a couch. When the physicians were finally allowed to examine him, they were shaking with such terror that they could barely hold their instruments because the atmosphere of the doctors' plot had made every medical move a potential act of treason. Stalin lingered in a state of agony for 4 long days while his children Wassily and Svetlana were brought to his bedside to witness the slow and rattling collapse of their father's iron body. He finally passed away on the evening of March 5, 1953, at the age of 74, and his daughter later described his final moment as a terrifying scene where he suddenly opened his eyes and pointed a finger upward with a look of immense rage, as if he were cursing the gods, or the very people standing over him. Before his heart finally stopped beating, his death triggered a wave of genuine and manufactured grief that saw millions of people weeping in the streets of Moscow, and a stampede at his funeral that claimed hundreds of lives as the populace struggled to imagine a world without the man who had been their god and their executioner for nearly 30 years. The man of steel was gone, but the shadows he cast over the world and the secrets of those final hours at Kuntsevo would continue to haunt the Soviet Union for decades. To be as his successors immediately began to fight over the ruins of his legacy and the blood-stained throne he had left behind. The announcement of Stalin's death on the morning of March 6, 1953 fell upon the Soviet Union like a sudden and massive thunderclap that silenced the entire nation from the Baltic to the Pacific, because for nearly 3 decades he had been the only sun in the sky and the only source of truth, and the people who had lived in the shadow of his terror found themselves weeping with a genuine and confusing grief for the man who had murdered their families and built their world. His body was moved to the Hall of Columns in the House of Unions, where he lay in state on a bed of roses under a massive portrait of his own stone-faced image, while hundreds of thousands of people queued for miles in the freezing Moscow cold just to catch a fleeting glimpse of the man of steel, who now looked small and fragile in his generalissimo's uniform. The crowds became so dense and the hysteria so profound that a massive stampede broke out in the narrow streets leading to the hall, where hundreds and perhaps thousands of people were crushed to death or trampled underfoot in a final and bitter sacrifice to the man who had always viewed human life as a mere statistic. Even as the masses mourned, the inner circle of henchmen known as the collective leadership were already engaged in a desperate and shadowy struggle for the throne that was still warm from Stalin's presence. Lavrenti Beria, the cunning and terrifying head of the secret police, immediately moved to seize the reins of power by controlling the security apparatus and proposing a series of radical reforms to distance himself from Stalin's crimes, while Georgy Malenkov and Nikita Khrushchev watched him with a murderous and justified suspicion. They realized that if Beria succeeded, he would eventually liquidate them all, just as Stalin had liquidated the old Bolsheviks, and so they formed a secret pact in the shadows of the funeral to destroy the man who knew too many of their secrets. On the day of the burial, Stalin's coffin was carried by his pallbearers across the Red Square and placed inside the Lenin Mausoleum, where his name was carved in stone next to his mentor's, marking what appeared to be the eternal preservation of his legacy. But even as the cannons fired their final salute, the machinery of the palace coup was already in motion, as Khrushchev quietly built a coalition of military generals led by the war hero Marshal Zhukov to confront Beria. The atmosphere in Moscow remained heavy with a mixture of fear and relief as the cult of personality began to show its first tiny cracks, and the successors realized that the only way to survive was to slowly and carefully dismantle the monster that Stalin had created. The shoemaker's son was now a mummy in a glass case, but his spirit continued to haunt the corridors of the Kremlin, where the men he had trained in the art of the purge were now preparing to turn those same weapons against each other in a final and bloody act of the Stalinist drama. In the immediate months following the burial, of the Man of Steel. The atmosphere in Moscow was like a tightly coiled spring where the collective leadership shared a hollow and treacherous peace while waiting for the first man to draw his blade. Lavrenti Beria, the master of the secret police and the keeper of the state's most shameful secrets, was the first to overreach his power by attempting to present himself as a great reformer and a man of peace, which only served to terrify his colleagues who knew the true depth of his cruelty. Nikita Khrushchev, the seemingly simple and jovial peasant from the coal mines of the Donbass, proved to be a master of the very political game Stalin had taught him, and he quietly organized a daring and secret alliance with Marshal Zhukov and the military high command to decapitate the security apparatus before it could swallow them whole. In June 1953, during a meeting of the Presidium inside the heavily guarded Kremlin, Beria was suddenly and violently arrested at gunpoint by Zhukov and a group of armed officers in a scene that mirrored the many arrests Stalin had ordered during the Great Terror. He was branded a British spy and a traitor to the revolution and was executed in the basement of the very prison where he had sent so many others to their deaths, marking the end of the first and most dangerous challenge to the post-Stalin order. Khrushchev then began a slow and calculated journey toward the supreme leadership by positioning himself as the man who would restore the party to its original Leninist roots and bring an end to the era of individual madness. The climax of this transformation occurred in February 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev delivered his legendary and earth-shattering secret speech titled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. For 4 long hours, in a room filled with thousands of shocked and weeping delegates, he systematically demolished the godlike myth of Stalin by detailing the horrific crimes of the purges and the catastrophic failures of the early war years and the personal paranoia that had turned the Soviet state into a slaughterhouse. He accused Stalin of betraying the very revolution he claimed to lead and of murdering tens of thousands of innocent and loyal communist comrades, while the audience listened in a state of absolute and terrifying silence as the icons of their world were smashed to pieces by his words. The speech was a political earthquake that shattered the global communist movement and triggered a wave of uprisings in Poland and Hungary as people realized that the master of the Iron World was officially dead and that his successors were desperately trying to wash the blood from their own hands. This period of de-Stalinization saw the release of millions from the gulags and the renaming of cities and the tearing down of thousands of statues that had once been the focus of a nation's worship. Stalin's body was eventually removed from the mausoleum next to Lenin and buried in a simple grave near the Kremlin wall under a layer of concrete, as if his successors were afraid that the Man of Steel might one day rise again to claim his throne. He had been downgraded from a deity to a criminal, but the system he built remained the foundation of the Soviet world, and his shadow continued to loom over every street and every factory and every heart in the empire he had created with iron and bone, even as the physical statues of the Man of Steel were pulled from their pedestals and crushed into gravel, and the cities that once proudly bore his name were rechristened to erase his memory. The structural and psychological legacy of Joseph Stalin remained embedded in the very marrow of the Soviet state like a permanent and painful scar. He had transformed a backward and illiterate agrarian society into a nuclear industrial titan in less than a generation, but he had done so at a cost of human life and suffering that defies the limits of the imagination, leaving a nation that was physically powerful but spiritually hollowed out by decades of states' fear and the systematic destruction of the individual soul. The planned economy he created with its massive factories and rigid quotas and total rejection of the market continued to churn for decades, but it was a system built for total war rather than human prosperity, and it eventually began to rust and stagnate under the weight of its own inefficiency and the lack of the terror that had once made its gears turn. His influence extended far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union as the Stalinist model of the one-party state, and the cult of personality was exported to Eastern Europe and China and North Korea and Vietnam, where his methods of mass mobilization and secret police control were adopted by a new generation of dictators who saw in the man of steel the ultimate architect of absolute power. In the minds of the people, the image of Stalin became a deeply fractured and contradictory icon, where older generations remembered him with a twisted sense of pride as the leader who had defeated Hitler and made the world tremble, while the survivors of the gulags and the families of the purged viewed his name as a synonym for the devil himself. As the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991, the debate over his place in history took on a new and fierce intensity in the new Russia, where the chaos of the post-Soviet era led many to look back with a strange and dark nostalgia at the stability and the perceived greatness of the Stalinist years. He became a tool for new political agendas, where his ruthless leadership was rebranded as effective management and his crimes were minimized as unfortunate necessities in the pursuit of national survival. Today his portrait can once again be found on the streets of Moscow, and his grave near the Kremlin wall is often covered in fresh red carnations as a modern Russia seeks to reclaim its status as a great power by invoking the ghost of the man who believed that might was the only true right in the world. The final tragedy of Stalin's life is not just the millions he killed, but the fact that he convinced so many that his way was the only way to achieve greatness, leaving a legacy that continues to haunt the global political landscape and serving as a permanent warning of what happens when a single human will is allowed to eclipse the value of every other human life on Earth. He remains a figure of iron and shadow, a man of steel whose heart was as cold as the Siberian wastes, and whose influence will likely be felt for as long as men seek to build empires on a foundation of fear. As the final chapter of this epic and blood-stained saga of Joseph Stalin draws to a close, we are left to confront the staggering and uncomfortable truth of a man who managed to reshape the entire world in his own cold and mechanical image, while leaving behind a trail of human wreckage that continues to haunt the global conscience. He was the ultimate practitioner of absolute power who believed that the end always justified the most horrific and violent means, and he proved to the world that a determined and pitiless individual could transform a peasant nation into a nuclear superpower through the sheer application of state terror and mass mobilization. His life serves as a dark and permanent warning about the dangers of the cult of personality and the fragility of human freedom when faced with a centralized machine of total control that views individuals as nothing more than expendable cogs in a grand ideological design. We must remember the millions of nameless souls who perished in the frozen silence of the Gulag, and the starving children of the Holodomor, and the shattered families of the Great Terror, because their lives were the true price paid for the iron factories and the massive dams and the victory over fascism that Stalin claimed as his own personal achievement. The lesson of the man of steel is not found in his military triumphs or his industrial statistics, but in the hollow silence of the societies he built, where fear became the primary language of human interaction, and where the light of truth was systematically extinguished to protect the myth of a single infallible leader. History shows us that while empires built on fear can reach heights of terrifying power, they are ultimately hollow at the core and destined to crumble under the weight of their own cruelty and inefficiency, leaving a legacy of trauma that takes generations to heal. Even today, as we see the return of strongman politics and the erosion of democratic values in various corners of the globe, the ghost of Stalin whispers a warning from the shadows of the Kremlin wall about the ease with which a society can sleepwalk into tyranny if it values national greatness over human dignity and security over liberty. He was a man who conquered half the globe, but could never conquer his own deep-seated paranoia, and he died in a pool of his own making, surrounded by people who were too terrified to save his life, which is perhaps the ultimate irony for a ruler who demanded absolute loyalty above all else. We conclude this journey into the heart of darkness by acknowledging that Joseph Stalin was not a monster from a fairy tale, but a human being who made specific and calculated choices to embrace evil in the pursuit of power, and by studying his life, we arm ourselves with the knowledge to recognize and resist the rise of the next man of steel before he can once again turn the world into a giant and silent prison. The story of Stalin is finished, but the duty to remember his victims and to safeguard the value of the individual remains. The ongoing task of every generation that wishes to live in the light of freedom and truth. With the official death of Stalin, the state archives of the Soviet Union became a silent and guarded graveyard of secrets, where the true extent of his individual decisions and his personal involvement in the machinery of death were locked away behind heavy iron doors and high-level security clearances for nearly 40 years. It was only during the era of glasnost in the late 1980s and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Empire that the world finally gained access to the primary sources that revealed the chilling and meticulous nature of his rule. The discovery of the shooting lists, which Stalin personally signed in red ink, proved beyond any doubt that he was not a distant or uninformed leader, but a micromanager of murder who took a deep and dark interest in the fate of specific individuals, and who often added names to the execution queues out of personal spite or ancient grudges. The archives revealed the secret protocols of the pact with Hitler, showing the cold and clinical way he traded away the lives of millions of Poles and Baltic citizens for the promise of a few miles of buffer zone and a few years of peace. Researchers found his private letters and his marginal notes in books which showed a man who was deeply intellectual and well-read, but who used his knowledge of history and literature only to better understand how to manipulate the masses and crush the spirit of his enemies. The hidden files of the NKVD showed that the Gulag was not just a system of punishment, but a fundamental part of the Soviet economic engine, where the labor of the dying was used to build the very infrastructure that the state celebrated in its glossy propaganda films. We now know that Stalin was obsessed with his own historical image and that he personally edited his own official biographies and the history textbooks of the Soviet Union to erase his rivals and to paint himself as the sole and indispensable architect of the October Revolution. The opening of the archives also shed light on the tragic and neglected stories of the ethnic minorities who were deported in their entirety to the plains of Central Asia, where hundreds of thousands died of cold and hunger in a series of forced migrations that Stalin ordered with the same casual indifference he showed when signing a grain quota. These documents provide a voice to the voiceless and ensure that the man of steel can no longer hide behind the wall of silence he built around his life. They serve as a bridge between the myth and the reality of his reign, showing that beneath the iron surface of the superpower was the landscape of deep and enduring trauma that was deliberately hidden from the eyes of the world. As we look at these yellowing pages and these faded signatures, we see the fingerprints of a tyrant who believed he could control history itself, but who eventually found that even the most powerful secrets will eventually find their way into the light of day. The archive is the final and most resilient witness to the truth of the Stalinist era, and its opening remains the most significant victory of memory over the forced amnesia of the Iron State. As we reach the ultimate conclusion of this exhaustive and harrowing journey through the life of Joseph Stalin, we must confront his enduring and controversial presence in the 21st century, where he remains a figure of intense fascination and bitter division, and a symbol of the unresolved trauma of the modern world. In the decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the image of the man of steel has undergone a startling and complex resurrection in the collective memory of many who live in the former territories of his empire, while the historians and the human rights activists continue to uncover the horrific depths of his crimes and the staggering numbers of his victims. There is a growing and paradoxical movement that seeks to rehabilitate his image as a symbol of order and national greatness and industrial strength. This nostalgia for the Iron Hand is often fueled by the chaos and the corruption and the perceived weaknesses of the post-Soviet transition, leading many people to forget the terror and the famine and to remember only the victory over Nazism and the status of the Soviet Union as a global superpower that made the world tremble with respect and fear. Today, in the streets of Moscow and Tbilisi, and even in the hearts of the younger generation who never lived under his rule, you can find his face on t-shirts and coffee mugs and posters as he is transformed into a hollowed-out brand of authoritarian nostalgia that ignores the blood-stained reality of his reign. However, the true verdict of history is not found in the fickle winds of public opinion or the calculated propaganda of modern politicians, but in the permanent and unchangeable facts of the millions of lives he extinguished and the generations he left scarred by the culture of silence and the loss of individual dignity. We must recognize that the Stalinist model was a dead end that eventually led to the stagnation and the collapse of the very system he claims to be building for eternity, and that the cost of his industrial miracle was a moral and human bankruptcy from which the world is still struggling to recover. His story is a final and absolute warning that when a society trades its liberty for the promise of security and national glory, under the command of a single man of steel, it eventually loses both its soul and its future in a sea of blood and iron. We leave this documentary with the understanding that Joseph Stalin was the architect of a world that we must never allow to return, and that the best way to honor his victims is to protect the values of truth and justice and human rights that he spent his entire life trying to destroy. The man is dead and the empire is gone, but the struggle between the iron will of the tyrant and the enduring spirit of human freedom continues. In every corner of the globe where people stand up to tell the truth against the power of the lie. Let the story of the shoemaker's son from Gori be a permanent reminder that even the most powerful walls and the most terrifying secrets cannot forever hide the light of the human conscience or the eventual and crushing weight of the historical verdict. The man of steel is gone, and the empire he built has crumbled into the dust of history, but the echoes of his reign still ring in the ears of the modern world as a reminder of what happens when power is left unchecked, and when the life of the individual is sacrificed for the glory of the state. We have traveled through the purges and the wars and the cold paranoia of his final days to understand not just a dictator, but the system of fear that he perfected. If you found this deep dive into the life of Joseph Stalin insightful, then please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to help us continue bringing these massive historical epics to life. Don't forget to leave a comment below, telling us which part of Stalin's life surprised you the most, or which historical figure you want us to cover in our next mega documentary series. Thank you for watching Historicon, where history never sleeps and the truth is always more chilling than fiction. We will see you in the next chapter of human history.